Officially welcome everyone who's still joining, still filing in. I'm sure the numbers will continue to increase. This is the latest in our Getting Hybrid Work Right series that we started back in, I think, June or July of last year, as so many companies were pivoting from having so many employees be fully remote to a more hybrid type work scenario. As I've been saying, for those that came in early, please have the chat open. We'll be using the chat throughout the call today. Please start by introducing yourself. Let us know where you're from, what organization you're with, whatever you'd like to share there over in the chat, what the weather's like, and so on. For those of you that aren't familiar with I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. Our sort of tagline, our motto, we discover the people practices that drive high performance. When we say high performance, we have a very specific definition for that. We're always looking at 4 factors: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And we use the 4 of those factors of high performance. When we do our major studies and even some of our smaller surveys, we ask a bunch of questions on a given topic, and then we're able to correlate the responses to those questions versus these 4 factors and really find out what practices are high-performing organizations doing versus low. And so we are a member-driven organization. You see here just a slice. This is only a small fraction of the I4CP member organizations that have access to all of our research. We do have some research pieces, blog posts, and even some studies that are available to the broader public. So I'd encourage everyone on the call to go to i4cp.com later today if you're not as familiar with us, see what's publicly available and see if there might be interest in your organization becoming a full member. I'd also like to give a special welcome to any actual folks from our member organizations on the call today. Always great to have a great mix of members and non-members on these Getting Hybrid Work Right call series. One of the things that we focus on at I4CP are so-called next practices. These are the things that high-performing organizations from our research we have found do more than low performers, but aren't being done very frequently yet. We call those next practices to distinguish them from the more common best practices. And we uncover so many of these and talk with our members about so many of these practices in human capital so often that we actually have a conference dedicated to the subject of next practices. You see here our conference that'll be coming up in mid-March. We are super excited about this one because it's going to be once again in person in lovely, warm Scottsdale, Arizona. We have held it at the Fairmont there in Scottsdale for many years in a row, except of course not the past 2 years due to the coronavirus pandemic. We had very well-attended virtual conferences the past 2 Novembers, of course, with great speakers, great content at those, great interaction and discussion, but there's nothing like getting back together in person. Yes, the Omicron variant is raging around the country, but I think all the data is indicating that it's going to be peaking very soon, perhaps already peaking in some areas. And we're getting strong registrations for this conference, even with that, because I think people realize that it'll be a bit less come that time. Not every company has their travel restrictions lifted. We recognize that, but many do. And we're seeing great enrollments coming in for this conference because of the great lineup of speakers that you see here. So we'd encourage you, go out to i4cp.com/conference. The URL is in the bottom right there. You can learn all about the agenda, the great program we've got lined up, and even register for you and your team. Another thing I wanted to note before we get into our main topic of today is our new 2022 priorities and predictions piece. This is available to all human resource leaders. You see some of the great organizations that had insights included in this piece. These specifically come, we have a few thought leaders included from our advisory board and others, but specifically the insights mostly are coming from our various boards. We have a CHRO board, a Chief Learning and Talent Officer board. We have Talent Acquisition board, Total Rewards board, DE&I board, and all of these boards contribute each year what they see as their top priorities and what their predictions are for the upcoming year. And then we aggregate them and put some narrative around it in this piece. It's usually one of our top downloaded pieces, if not the #1 downloaded piece from I4CP each year. So I'd encourage you, again, check that out at i4cp.com. Again, welcome to those that are joining late. Make sure you have the chat open. We'll be using that throughout the call today. Introduce yourself. Let us know where you're joining from, what organization you're with. So for those rolling off of a previous meeting, glad to have you with us. In these Getting Hybrid Work Right calls from I4CP, we've been covering a range of different topics. Probably the most frequent has been the various levels and issues around vaccine mandates, vaccines, testing, and vaccine actual mandates. And we're going to do that one more time today. If I had to predict, this might be the last time, at least for a while, that we cover this topic heavily as the central topic of this series. But given the SCOTUS Supreme Court ruling on the OSHA mandate, and given the rise of the Omicron variant into the new year, we did want to have this be the focus at least this one more time to get some good discussion going. And because we did a pretty robust survey just recently on the subject of vaccines, vaccine mandates, testing, and so on. And we've got some great data to share with you, which I'll be doing here to spur the conversation. So I wanted to just start off with sort of a review of some of the headlines that we've all been seeing. First, yes, the top left there, the Supreme Court blocking President Biden's vaccine or test mandate for companies with 100 or more employees. The other part of that, of course, was for healthcare workers, which was upheld by the Supreme Court. So it's sort of a two-pronged solution from the Supreme Court. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. You see some of the other headlines here, a lot of discussion from a lot of sources around what does this mean for employees. We'll get into some of the data on that from our most recent survey. And then the headline sort of provocative in the bottom right, given the nature of Omicron, given how fast it's spreading, given its less deadly consequences, it seems, what does that mean for mandates in general? Interesting questions there. Companies are reacting very differently, both to the OSHA mandate situation and just to the pandemic in general. We've probably almost everyone on the call has seen some of the headlines recently. Citigroup, but not only Citigroup, I think also JP Morgan and various other companies still very much moving forward with vaccine policies and vaccine requirements for their people. You may have seen the headline about Meta, aka Facebook, delaying their office reopening and also announcing a requirement for boosters coming in March. So they are giving employees some time to get the boosters, but that is being something that's required, at least of those coming back to the office. But then on the flip side, you see companies like GE, and just this morning I saw the headline, so I quickly added it here to the slide, Starbucks announcing that they're going to end their worker vaccination requirements and testing. So interesting mix of companies here, and that'll be part of our conversation today. So just to quickly review, for those that maybe haven't kept up with it, what the Supreme Court decided. They, in a 6-3 majority ruling, they decided basically two things. One, that the OSHA ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard, was effectively not constitutional and was being, in the language of journalism, shot down, if you will. That was going to go into effect for companies with 100 or more employees. So that is no longer going to be proceeding. On the flip side, those that work in healthcare, particularly any healthcare companies that accept Medicare or Medicaid from the federal government, that separate requirement, which came from a different agency, and that was, I think, a key aspect of the split decision here, was that it was from a different agency, that they did have the power to require vaccination for those healthcare workers. And this is a big momentous decision. It had gone back and forth in the appeals court. I think it was the Fifth Circuit had put a stay on it, and then the Sixth Circuit had said no, it should proceed. And now finally we get the final answer from the Supreme Court that the OSHA ETS will not be proceeding. So at this point, I want to pivot to discussion, and I want to start us off with a poll. So thank you, Alex, for launching the poll here. Will this recent Supreme Court announcement alter your organization's approach to employee vaccine testing and policy? So read through the possible response options here, and we'll give everyone a solid 60 seconds rather, to respond, and then we'll start up a discussion. Thank you, everyone, for responding to the poll. And again, for those that have joined late, please do open your chat, because I would love to, as we get discussion going here, would love to hear from folks both coming off mute on audio and over in the chat as well. All right, Alex, I think the responses have trickled to us a crawl here, so let's go ahead and share the results out. So as we can see, the number one response, no, we still plan to require vaccines. 30% indicating that was what they're doing in response to the Supreme Court. So still planning to require vaccines of all on-site employees. Let's see, I've just expanded this so I can read it a little bit better. We've got 26% saying yes, we will or likely will change the approach. So almost as many saying that they will change it. 26% still planning, given that this is very recent news. So as we look at these results, I'd love to hear from a few of you. And I'm not going to say only people that responded a certain way. Anyone care to come off mute and share with us a little bit more about what your organization's doing or why? Anyone?
Hello, this is Claudia from Canada.
Hi, Claudia. Good to hear from you.
Hello. I'm going to say that it's a bit early to tell what we're going to do in the future. In Canada, the employer is still responsible for the health and safety of its employees in the workplace. So regardless of these Supreme Court decisions, the employer is still liable, right? So we still have to keep that in mind before canceling or making changes to any policies, especially, thinking that we were going to be out of the woodworks with this COVID, and now a new variant came into play. So we just have to be very careful as these waves keep going up and down, and just think about the future consequences of doing one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And interesting that you're from Canada, where the Supreme Court, wouldn't have had jurisdiction anyway, right. The U.S. Supreme Court. But appreciate that and good comments there. Anyone else? I'm wondering too if there's anyone that for some companies, the Supreme Court or the OSHA ETS was providing sort of air cover for policies mandating either vaccination or the vaccination versus testing. If you had that option as well, how does that come into play for anyone or any other aspects of this? Would love to hear from some folks.
This is Lori from Ecolab, and we're headquartered in Minnesota, but we operate all over the world and in all of the states across the country. So technically we should be under the federal contractor mandate, which is currently on stay and has not yet been decided from a Supreme Court ruling perspective. We were going with the OSHA ETS that applies to us, which is now out of the door. The thing we're struggling with the most, I think, is that we have multiple cities, counties, and states that are now issuing their own different mandates for different industries that we service. So sometimes it's in restaurants, sometimes it's in healthcare, sometimes it's everywhere, sometimes it's in a school, sometimes it's booster, sometimes it's you could test, sometimes there's a kind of, so we're like navigating this really crazy plane, like New Jersey just did one that we saw an announcement for, that we have to figure out how to comply with while we're in the middle of, are we going to do an employer mandate or not? And is it worth it or not? Now, the good news is we've been pushing based on the contractor mandate, and we're probably at 90% of our population is vaccinated, which is great, but we don't want to lose 10% of our workforce either. So we're kind of a little bit in a holding pattern while some of the dust settles. But while we're in that holding pattern, it's getting way more complicated.
Right. Well, as we just saw in the poll here, you're not alone. A sizable chunk said don't know yet, holding pattern. thinking it through, reevaluating all of those things probably apply for not only you at Ecolab. And welcome, by the way. I know Ecolab is a member of I4CP, so great to have members of Ecolab here with us. So thank you, Lori, for that. You're definitely not alone. Anyone else? Wanted to bring up this first data point from our latest pulse survey that we just ran. We had over 400 people respond, so a pretty good data set here. We asked about your current definition of full vaccination. This is something that's been fascinating to see develop over time. And I wanted to particularly highlight 24% indicating that they're already including boosters in their definition of vaccinated. Also wanted to note 15% said other, and some of those were that they would include boosters in the definition soon, by February 1st, by March sometime. Again, that was the headline I shared earlier about Meta and Facebook. But then also a lot of companies just indicating we're going to follow CDC guidance, and CDC actually doesn't yet include booster in their definition of so-called full vaccination. But when they do, then our company will follow suit with that. At least that's the intention right now. Obviously, the number one response is just following current CDC, which is, and other equivalent organizations around the world to the CDC, 48% saying that it's either both shots of a 2-dose vaccine or the single J&J. So wondering if anyone has any comments here. Anyone here on the call today that has already shifted their definition of full vaccine to include at least one booster? Would be interested in hearing that and maybe what the thought process was there. Or whether you're including, if you're including booster in your definition of vaccination, then presumably if you're requiring full vaccination, then you're also requiring boosters. Is there anyone on the call that their organization fits in that bucket? Feel free to respond in the chat as well if you're not wanting to come off mute. There is a range of sort of policies going on. We had a question that asked about a host of things, and instead of sharing the bar chart, I thought I would share these sort of two spectrums that I created. One on vaccine policy. So we found 52% of organizations said that they're encouraging but not requiring full vaccination for employment. That's at one end of the spectrum. At the far right side of the spectrum, the more strict, 35% are requiring full vaccination for all employees, regardless of work location. So even including remote employees in that case. So interesting to see that a third or more, 35% requiring that. And then sort of in between, you've got 26% that indicated proof of full vaccination required for any business travel, 33% requiring proof of full vaccination to enter actual work sites. So interesting results here. Curious if anyone wants to come off mute and comment on at least the top half, and then we'll get to testing here in a moment. Where does your organization fall on the spectrum? And there's even more fine-grained delineations than the 4 I've got here, but these were the 4 that we had data on. Is there anyone on the call that is whose organization is requiring full vaccination for all employees, even those that are remote, that far right of the spectrum? I'm curious about that, or the other side, the least required, just encouraging still. Anne, I see you've come off mute.
Yeah, I'm with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, and as a in the healthcare industry, we are interpreting, we are interpreting that we are required, and so we are still on the full mandate, and it is a 2-dose mandate for all the reasons you just said. And even though 60% of our associates are categorized as teleworkers, remote associates going forward, we're requiring it of all. And much of the reasoning there is because of our mission as in the healthcare world, and a belief from our chief medical officer that the world is better off if everyone's vaccinated, and we need to contribute to that really as a more closer aligned with our mission than pure, compliance, if you will.
Yeah, I like the alignment with your organization's mission. I think that's always wise to do for a range of things. And just a quick follow-up, do you think, I know this is asking you to make a prediction, but do you think that your organization will require the booster sort of in alignment with CDC if they themselves go in that direction?
Yes, I would guess that, because we've been pretty firmly sticking with CDC and using that as, an explanation for why, a justification in part for why we are requiring things. But right now we're not, and we've been asked very specifically by folks, do we need to have the booster? And for now we're saying no. And I think if it shifts, we probably will.
Would your organization fall under the Medicare, Medicaid?
Yes, we take, because we're processing claims through there, and that's where I think our leadership is pretty comfortable with the whole mandate notion. And I think it's very convenient that it aligns with regulations, if you will. So,
well, and I'm not a lawyer, but legally it may be that, the definition of full vaccination, should that officially become including booster, then those that are falling under that Medicare, Medicaid mandate, that may make the decision for you.
Yeah, it may. And, as a health insurance and healthcare company, we are quite conservative and risk adverse a lot for the protection of the people we serve. So I do think we tend to, go that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I would agree with what you're speculating.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone else that Kim and Lorraine and Savannah and Bethany, and Lori, Shirley that have been chiming in on the chat. Any of you want to come off mute and speak to your comments a little bit more fully? Would love to hear from you, or anyone else.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Dorsett, Chief Human Resources Officer for Capital Impact Partners and CD Small Business Finance. And we are requiring our employees to be fully vaccinated, but we have not changed to include the booster. But in essence, what we've been trying to do is prioritize the employees' overall safety and well-being, but also respect their personal decision. So we're just saying that if you're coming into the office or acting as an agent of the organization, you need to be fully vaccinated. And so that way, if you choose, because we have not received any requests for any exceptions as far as religious or medical reasons. So we've also indicated to our employees that when we return to the office, which is right now tentatively scheduled for April, that's also your choice in regards to when you return and also the frequency. So we're trying to be as flexible as we possibly can and agile during this time period of finalizing what our hybrid work model will look like.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kim. You're also not alone. You sort of fall in that 33% here on that top spectrum, proof of full vaccination required by employees to enter work sites. And you cited a few other criteria as well that would require it. So
sure. And in response to Rex, right now we have about 270 employees, and we're right now between 10 to 13 different states that we have employees in.
Great. Wanted to note the bottom part of this slide, which was another part of the same question. We asked regarding testing for unvaccinated employees. 24% said that negative tests are required for unvaccinated employees to be on site. 23% said regular testing is required for unvaccinated employees as condition of employment. The reason those only add up to the 47%, you'd have some folks that don't know the policy, of course, but then you've got those that are requiring full vaccination, to which tests simply don't arise as an issue. So I'm curious if anyone has any comments for those of you that aren't requiring full vaccination, say for all, where would you be on this spectrum? In terms of testing for unvaccinated employees, or frankly, testing for even those that are vaccinated. Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, was recently quoted in an article as saying that, making the interesting point that the only way to truly know to truly have a safe environment would be to require pretty regular testing, even day of testing, for folks to come on to corporate work sites, given that the number of people, especially with Omicron, who are vaccinated, even boosted, that are still coming down with the Omicron variant is pretty high. And so I think some organizations may move to fairly regularly testing for all, not just the unvaccinated. So I'd love to hear any comments from folks on the testing front. Anyone have any testing policies that they can speak to at their organizations right now? And how is it going? Are you able to get the tests, or is there a shortage in some parts of the country?
Yeah, hi, my name's Peter Wilms, and I'm from Cisco, the food company. And we've been requiring on-site testing for about the past 2 months. And that's for when anybody comes into the building. We have those rapid tests. And that's just to have some type of control. And that's given us the adaptive ability to do what we need to do.
Yeah, very good, Peter. Again, that you're definitely not alone, as you can see the numbers here on the slide, but appreciate you giving voice to that. And thank you for clarifying Cisco with an S, the food company, not Cisco with a C, the technology company. Thank you also to Sherry, who in the chat said that in health insurance, they are requiring testing for employees who are required to be on site, and those that want to be on site every 7 days. I'm curious if anyone is moving to either recommended or even required more frequent testing. I know the OSHA ETS and some of the other mandates that allowed for testing had said it at every 7 days, but with the rapid spread of Omicron and just the nature of that variant, I'm wondering if anyone is taking the Mark Benioff Salesforce line and actually looking at even considering more frequent testing than every 7 days. All right, not hearing anyone on that. Let me move on to another question that we asked in our pulse survey. In which of the following ways do you expect the OSHA vaccine mandates to affect your organization's culture? Now, we did ask this question before the announcement from the Supreme Court, before it was struck down. But nonetheless, I think this data is still illuminating that the most frequent answers, the blue bars, those that are saying they're already experiencing these effects on culture, or the lighter blue, they expect to experience it, are all on the negative side. So more divisiveness in the workplace. You see that as one of the top responses, talent loss because of implementing the mandate, or in this case, implementing your own vaccine mandate at the organization level, and then decreased ability to attract talent. Now, there is a flip side to that. There were organizations that answered in the opposite: increased ability to retain talent, enhanced ability to attract talent, less divisiveness in the workplace, but it was less. There were fewer companies indicating that than the negative effects. So I'm curious if we might get some representatives from both sides of this. Are there some of you that are already seeing the negatives, or maybe some that are seeing positive impacts? Certainly is a challenging labor market overall, and the introduction of any complication, regulation, what have you, can make it more challenging. But we're seeing here both the positive and the negative. So I'm curious, Kim.
Yeah, so I'm going to be curious to see how this will show up in the workplace for those. We're 85% of our employees are vaccinated. So I'm curious with that remaining 15, how this is going to show up, because we have a few selected employees who have been very vocal in regards to their personal choice. And so I'm curious to see how this is going to show up.
And when did you say your return to office date was set for?
So we proceeded with a 3-phase approach. So we began our first phase in September of last year, where we opened up the office to 25% of the employees, which we did not satisfy, but we had a number of employees that were eager to return to the office. So we were trying to accommodate them. We proceeded with our second phase, which was January of this year, where we opened it up to 50%. We may be up to 20% of our employees.
No, yeah.
And consistently, we've seen with the surveys that we've administered to our employees, at least it's close to, it varied between 48 to 52% of our employees, if given the preference, would stay home or work remotely 100%. So we are scheduled April 1st for the offices to be opened up to 100% of our employees. And right now, we're still consistently seeing about half of our employees' preference is to stay home. But I think it's going to be revisited, because once we notified them that we're prepared to proceed, and that for them to be able to maintain their designated desks, they need to be in the office majority of the week. And so now they're rethinking that because of just the concept of hoteling and not having a designated space.
Right. Yeah, that'll be an interesting decision point for some folks. Those that you said, though, that feel very strongly about the vaccine, may be willing to give up their desk. And unless you mandate that they come back to the office, then it won't necessarily come to a head of conflict for those folks.
And also I agree, and I appreciate in the predictions and trends and so forth. I also think we should not say the Great Resignation, but what we're trying to do as part of our efforts in regards to continuous retention, as well as attracting talent, is trying to avoid any resignations of personal conflict. And we want to continue to be an employer of choice.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that sentiment. And thanks for the call back to our CEO, who is often with me co-hosting these calls today. He's on some much deserved time off today. He, in our priorities and predictions piece in the introduction, said that he's sick and tired of the phrase great resignation or great anything to describe things that aren't great, that are quite negative. They're not great at all. And even things like great reshuffle, which is more value neutral. He's tired of those phrases. So appreciate that call back, Kim.
Sure, happy to.
Yeah, anyone else here, either on it's increasing the issues around talent retention and attraction, or maybe on the increasing, again, maybe Ann's point about it being reflected in the company's values and so on, maybe helping people to be attracted to the organization.
Hey, Tom, this is Michelle from DTE Energy. We're a utility out in Michigan here. I just wanted to add to what Kim was talking about around hoteling stations. So one of the things we're doing at DTE is we've had each of the business units kind of put together business cases of what they thought they were going to need for the future. And the majority of our employees, we are not going to have dedicated desks anymore. They're primarily hotel stations, except for like some of our service centers and what have you. But in our downtown headquarters, I would say a majority of our employees will not have dedicated workstations in their hoteling stations. And we're actually implementing a new system. It's called Engage, where people can reserve those hotel stations. And we're piloting that right now. We've phased in our employees. It's about a 5-phased approach. The first phase was September of last year, and we allowed our executives to come in and start using the Engage system and our redesigned floors of Agile. The second phase was to allow directors to come in and start to play with the app and use the Agile floors. Those two have been postponed just because of the increase of cases, but we're working towards bringing in a 1,000 employee pilot where they can come in when they need to. And our direct message is that you only come in based on the important why, right? So a lot of things you can be successful doing remote, but we're asking them to think about the whys you're asking employees to come in. So, do you need to do complex mapping sessions, strategic sessions, and so forth? Those, team recognition and team building kind of things. So we are kind of trying to take the bottom up approach of why do you need to come in, except for our daily employees that have been sequestered to, like we have a bill print and mail area where they come in every day. But for the majority of our team, it's remote hybrid, and then the whys will drive what brings them in. But hoteling stations is really where we're moving towards.
I love the fact that you're focusing on the why for those roles that, by function, it's not a necessity that they be in, where they at least have the option functionality wise to be remote or hybrid or on site. We've long looked at the importance of intentionality, which is just a synonym for looking at the sort of the why of the purpose of things. We did some research years ago on collaboration, and we titled that Purposeful Collaboration. So the concept of purpose and intentionality and why came up there. And then more recently, with all of everything going around with hybrid and remote work, I think, initially there was the reaction phase in early 2020 in March, April, May, but then people quickly started to think about the why, and they quickly started to think about intentionality around what are we going to do, exactly why. You need to have transparency and be able to communicate that. Employees are at this point aren't going to just follow the orders without understanding the why. And you'll have a lot better morale with folks if they can be on board with that, understand the purpose, and make it based on that. So kudos to you for sure for doing that. And we're seeing that in a lot of the interviews we conduct, a lot of our board and exchange meetings. Intentionality in leadership decisions is critical today. And I see Kristen Cole in the chat saying that as well, all caps, adamant with all of my leaders that they need to focus on what the job needs in terms of working from a specific location and not their personal working preference. Certainly before COVID, remote work was much more of a niche. We all recognize that. And there was a lot of leadership by preference that was going on. And while there's still some vestiges of that today, I'd like to think that the trend of that will go down as we focus more and more on the why and being truly intentional in our decision making. Talking a little bit about that, workplace safety policies. We did ask a question here. What have you already implemented? The dark blue. What do you plan to implement? The light blue, and you see the other response options. We asked about masking, requiring all employees who work on site to wear masks, very common, 2/3 saying they've already implemented that as a safety policy. Interesting though, that 1 out of 6 or so, 15% are requiring only employees who aren't fully vaccinated to wear masks. So interesting that some companies are going in that direction. On the physical layout, so reconfiguring office layout in terms of conferences, cubicles, and so on, 46% there. Not surprising that 67% would just be spacing things out a bit more. This plays into how much office real estate you actually need. The big prediction early on in the pandemic was that a lot of companies, once their leases were up, it wasn't going to be immediate, but once the leases were up, they would be downsizing and getting rid of a lot of office space. And that will happen certainly for some organizations, but for others, it may net to not a big change. If you have fewer people coming in on a regular basis between remote and hybrid workers, but you're going to space things out more and have more open plan spaces, then you may need just as much space after all. It just needs to be reconfigured. And then you see here 26%, the bottom left, providing a hoteling reservation system. That also came up in a couple of the case studies we did. My colleague Carol Morrison did 2 really great interviews with JLL and McKinstry, who are both in the corporate real estate business. And they had a lot to say around all of these things, around physical layout changes, hoteling reservation systems, and so on. And then on the bottom right, you see some other practices, sort of the least common that organizations are doing. About 1 in 5 are adjusting work or job requirements. Less than 10%, only 8% adapting the workspace to separate those that are vaccinated from those that aren't. And then very few, 5%, indicating that they're requiring some sort of visual identification for those that are vaccinated versus not. Although I will note that the somewhat higher percentage requiring those that aren't fully vaccinated to wear masks is somewhat of a visual identifier. Some people might choose to wear masks regardless, even if they're vaccinated, but in some ways that can be an identifier as well. So I want to open it up again. What are you all doing? Some of you that maybe want to comment on some of these policies, if you put them in place, some of these safety practices, or maybe some other ones that aren't listed here, anything innovative going on out there. And again, feel free to share in the chat, as many of you are doing. What are organizations doing around safety right now, given the very fast spread of the admittedly weaker for most people, disease level, but very fast spreading Omicron variant.
Well, Tom, this is Kristen. At Red Wing, we have some exemptions that have been approved. And at this point, what we're doing is we haven't technically reopened our corporate facilities. It's more on a volunteer basis. Of course, we have manufacturing and retail where they are, obviously in person. But for those that go back, we just have a blanket. Everybody wears a mask at this point. We've had a lot of discussion, to your point, around perceived inequity and potential judgment and discrimination against people wearing masks or not wearing masks.
Right.
And that continues to be discussion. But right now it's just masking for everyone.
Right. Well, and I'm glad to hear that you're in that majority there in the top left, requiring all to wear masking. And I think part of that is, like you say, the perceived inequality, the sort of clue that might give as to people's vaccination status, but also just the nature of the Omicron variant, the nature of really all the variants, COVID going back from the very beginning, that the vaccines are not bulletproof, the boosters are not bulletproof, and so having that extra, at least perceived protection of the mask can still come into play. Alyssa.
Yeah, I don't have much to share as far as our practices, but I wanted to share a question we're asking ourselves to see if other folks are in the same boat. So I think from the beginning of us thinking about physical layout changes, there was kind of this, are we talking about, well, the pandemic is still ongoing, or are we talking about post-pandemic? And as time went by, the question kept being raised. It's like, well, when is post-pandemic? We have no idea when we're getting out of this thing. And so it's difficult when we're thinking about our physical layout changes. We're trying to have a very iterative, agile approach to it. But it's difficult because there's some things that we're thinking about with hoteling where the physical space separation really wouldn't be there because we're thinking post-pandemic. And so it may be a while before we get to use those, but we also are leery of setting up permanent spaces that take into account that social distancing when that might not be a factor for much longer.
All eternity. Yeah.
It could be another month, it could be another 2 years, no one's sure.
Yeah, I know that's a great point. The social distancing aspect might go away at some point. I do think that hoteling as a process, as a layout mechanism, as an approach to providing workspace is probably here to stay, because I think hybrid work is here to stay with people, having more flexibility. I've heard, that a lot of companies are really planning to have it be hybrid for basically forever at this point, with still maybe nailing down exactly what hybrid means for them and having some agility and flexibility on that front. But that's where the hoteling approach to the real estate would come into play long term. Anyone else here on any of these safety policies or corporate real estate policies, if you will?
I'll just add, this is Michelle from DTE. The way we're trying to approach it is we're going to be using our system to force the force the 6 feet apart if we still are in a pandemic, right? So we can block out certain desks in hotels very easily on the app that would prevent people from, sitting too close to each other. However, you can't prevent human behavior of just sitting down where they need to or where they want to, but at least the app will help us drive where we want them to sit based on if we're in a pandemic or not.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are used to that at this point. We've all been into restaurants or into airport areas where they've blocked off certain seats, usually with just a simple card or a lanyard on the table. Other times with something much more dramatic, like something that almost approaches police tape or something. But I think at this point, this many years into this, we are all pretty used to that. So I'd like to think you're absolutely right. There's no controlling for human behavior, but I'd like to think most people will respect what the system is saying in terms of what seats are available and which aren't.
Hey, Tom, hey, I'll add, again, Blue Cross Blue Shield. So many interesting things have happened in terms of our company transitioning from what was a 20% remote workforce to now over 60%. So when it came to real estate, it was a good opportunity to kind of clean up everything. Everybody came in, moved everything out, we had very settled people in designated workstations, and now it's more spread out and people have a lot of options. And what we're seeing though is right now we've been very flexible with the Omicron thing. We sort of backed off with trying to invite people to come, left it completely open and flexible right now for them to choose. But we do have a hybrid designated group and an on-site group that's about 35% of our company. And when we come back, we've already started seeing a desire for people to get away from pure hoteling. They want to bring their stuff. They want to go back to a little bit more of a. So we were predicting that at some point, if they are coming into the office really regularly, and we have plenty of space, why not let them have that? But we want to give it a try before we just immediately go back to the old way.
Yeah, well, and that I heard the word if they are coming in regularly, and that's where you'll have some policies and guidelines around that. If you're coming in, only one day a week, you won't be eligible for that kind of space, presumably. But if you're coming in 4 days a week with just that 5th day as an optional day, then you probably deserve to have that dedicated space, given that it sounds like, as you said, you do have the space available.
Yep, that's our situation.
Hey, Lisa.
Hi. Yeah, that's what we've done too, actually. And we've labeled them as resident desks rather than saying that you have a permanent desk. We've just called them resident desks, and there are certain parameters around that. So if you're in the office 4+ days a week, if you have unique accommodation needs, those are some of the reasons why people would qualify for a resident desk, and then they're taken off desk booking system.
Yeah, I like that word resident. It's something we're all familiar from just real estate and living arrangements, but it's also a term from academia. There are resident scholars that come in and have a spot. They have an office for say 1 or 2 years. So I think there's a certain level of respect that the word resident provides for folks that have that sort of stability in their decision.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. All right, let me pivot to incentives. I'm just looking at the clock here and we've got about 11 minutes left. I wanted to share with you what some organizations are still doing to incentivize greater vaccination. So you see here again, the dark blue have already implemented, the light blue is planning to implement. Top responses being paid time off for employees who need recuperation time. That was actually a part of the OSHA ETS, as well as I think pretty much all of the vaccine mandates from the federal government needing to provide that. So not surprising that would be the #1 answer. Also paid time off to actually get the vaccine. Not surprising that that's high. Providing education or educational materials are a relatively easy thing for organizations to do. And we've certainly had plenty of time at this point to do that. Past those top 3, there's quite a drop off. Admittedly, not every organization has the space or the resources to offer vaccinations on site, but interesting that 26% said they're already doing so. A little bit of a drop given boosters are more recent, but 19% offering boosters. I expect that number would become identical to the vaccine number on site if and when the CDC makes the definition change, if they do. And then you see the things that are far less frequently done there on the right. Linking vaccination to your overall employee well-being programs. Always like to see integration of thinking and values and purpose whenever you can. Cash or other gift cards, things like that, remuneration for going ahead. So sort of an incentive to the pocketbook. And then you see some of the other ones there on the bottom right that are fairly low numbers. Any comments or thoughts on this? Anything organizations are doing, and has it had any impact? I'd be curious, not just what you're doing, but did you see a bump up after implementing some sort of incentive program? I know a lot of organizations have fairly high vaccination levels already across their employee population, or at least certain segments, 80, 90%. And so further incentivizing might not be in the cards, or maybe you would only see a couple percentage point increase, but curious to see what people think. Lisa.
Yeah, we've got about 92% of our employees are fully vaccinated. We've offered them time off to get vaccines for them and their families, so if they have to take kids as well. And we don't allow anybody into our offices, employees or visitors, who are not fully vaccinated. So they had to attest and submit proof, and then they can come into the office. So
Yeah. In a sense, that's another incentive, being able to actually
yeah,
come
sort
in.
of.
Lori, I see you in the chat saying you did have great success going from 65% to over 90 after launching a campaign with Sweepstakes. Can you come off mute and say a little bit more about that? That's an impressive bump.
Yeah, we, again, because thought we were going to be under the federal contractor mandate, we pulled a program team together. I would say it was late October, and very quickly went to, we created a medical panel to answer a lot of questions that people had. We launched a massive sweepstakes. We had cash prizes that were net to the employee, one at 100,000, two at 50,000, two at 25,000. And then probably another 60 or so at the $5,000 level, with the intent that every plant, every campus, and every business would have winners within each of their respective areas, at least at the 5,000. The 25,000 and up were national. But we wanted to make it really close into somebody in this plant will win at least $5,000. And so depending on the size of the location, we allocated those amounts across. We had a lot of pushes, otherwise as well, right? They had to be fully vaccinated with documentation, fully uploaded in Workday by December 31st to be eligible. And so I think, some people may have already been vaccinated and just finally did the administrative part of it to become eligible. We did do on-site clinics at the plants and at our campus locations as well, which likely also helped. And of course, we provided the paid time off to do so. And we had a COVID sick time policy if you had negative effects where you felt under the weather after you got your shot and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, so you did several of the things here, but those are some pretty significant cash prizes. So you're definitely putting your money where your corporate values are. That's
impressive. We did a big thanks a million campaign kind of thing because the total amount ended up being around $1 million.
Wow.
And we just did the drawing 10 days ago, so they haven't quite announced all the winners yet. So I'm anxious to see the names. I did find out I was not one of them. So, but it was really fun to do.
Wow, very interesting. We have a question here in the chat from Kristen. She asks, I've seen the phenomenon of quit and stay with many people who felt forced and coerced by our company to get vaccinated. Can you say a little bit more about your question, Kristen?
Yeah, we were also, we were told that we're under the federal, contractor mandate, although there's been a lot of questioning from people who don't believe that's true. So that's actually created a lot of upheaval. And being an HR business partner, I have a lot of people come and bend my ear about that, which is great. I want to hear from everybody. But there's a lot of people who, because I don't know if it was the way it was rolled out or just the fact that it was so quick or there was no, it was just like, we have to do this, do it now. And people felt very pressured with the timeline. That I know quite a few people who said, well, I got it, or I guess I'm getting it, but I'm not giving this company 10 more minutes of my time because I feel like I was forced to do something I didn't want to do, forced to make a choice about my livelihood.
Gotcha.
So whether it's the company, the government, both, whatever, but I see a lot of people very frustrated now.
Yeah, so a hit on engagement level, a hit on morale, no further discretionary effort will be given on behalf of the company, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Yeah, well, that speaks to the couple of slides back where more companies are indicating, problems with retention, attraction, but also just overall engagement, more so on the negative side than the positive side, although there is that split there. Lori noting that also seeing small pockets of that at her company as well. Wanted to bring up this question. What measures, if any, has your organization implemented regarding employees who choose not to be vaccinated and are not otherwise exempt from vaccination, religious or medical reasons? So termination of employment. We saw one of the headlines earlier that Citibank, I believe JP Morgan and some others have announced that they will be terminating people as of a certain date coming up if they're not fully vaccinated. So 21% said that is something they've already implemented. So 1 out of 5. Requiring the unvaccinated to regularly test. Fewer companies doing that, but under consideration at about 1 out of 5. And then you see some of the other differing policies here. Anyone have comments on this? I know we're running short on time here. We have about 5 minutes left. Anyone maybe in the consideration phase for some of these things, or that you've already pulled the trigger on some of these approaches? And again, feel free to share in the chat if you prefer. Wanted to also share a little bit about return to the workplace, return to the office for remote workers. So we did ask this question regarding your return to the workplace plan. For those that were required to work remotely during the pandemic, where their role was relevant for that, sort of what's your time frame for coming back? 31% top response employees began returning, but then the Delta and even more so the Omicron variant caused us to expand those plans. So definitely some shifts going on, almost a third of companies in that boat. 18% said indefinitely working remotely with no timetable. 13% returning at some point in 2022. Although given that we're in January, that's a pretty big window. Anyone with, I'm particularly curious with anyone that had to make that shift. If you're in that 31% where you had a plan and then Omicron sort of disrupted it, any comments there?
This is Lori again. I think we had several plans that got disrupted by different things. And so we just stopped giving dates.
Yeah, right.
Right.
I think a lot of
We'll give
companies
you a
have done
30-day
that.
notice.
Yeah.
That's
Bethany
exactly what
in
we did too. We said, we'll just let you know.
Yeah, and Bethany in the chat, we have
Same
twice
here.
suspended our phase 2. Shirley, I saw you come off mute.
Yes, we did the exact same thing. We were wanting to give dates because in the absence of dates, people feel uncertain, but
Yeah.
we've now pushed one group back to March 7th because there are a lot of childcare setups that people need to do. So we can't turn that on a dime.
Right.
But we are even pushing a more skeletal crew that is on site. If they don't absolutely have to be there, we've asked them not to be there.
Well, it seems like from the chat and from all of you on audio, that seems to be the situation that a lot of us are in. All right, well, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank everyone who participated today, whether you were just listening in or were contributing to the conversation. Appreciate all of you. We meet every other Thursday for these Getting Hybrid Work Right calls. The focus today was on the OSHA ETS and the SCOTUS ruling and vaccine mandates. I very much anticipate future meetings will be on all sorts of other aspects of getting hybrid work right, starting Thursday, February 3rd. Watch for more information on that session and other sessions coming up. And again, a reminder, the I4CP Next Practices Now conference is going forward, and it will be in person in lovely Scottsdale, Arizona, March 14th through the 17th. Registrations are still coming in, even in the face of Omicron and travel uncertainty. So we would love to see you sign up for that event. This is Tom Stone, Senior Research Analyst at I4CP. I'm so glad that all of you took time out of your busy day to join us, and look forward to having you again on future calls. See you, everyone. Have a good week.